All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating and honestly pretty heavy report from Alvarez Consulting called The Colonized Cross. Have you ever stopped to wonder how history actually shapes our deepest, most personal beliefs today? Well, we're going to impartially unpack this extensive theological and cultural analysis. This report takes a completely unflinching look at how colonial institutions historically weaponized Christianity to erase African and indigenous spiritual systems, and more importantly, it explores why that historical mechanism is still deeply impacting communities right now. Let's kick things off by anchoring ourselves in the report's core premise regarding the true nature of historical control. The authors make a really compelling argument. Yes, physical subjugation was undeniably brutal, but the ultimate victory for colonial powers was actually psychological. It was spiritual. To truly dominate a civilization, you don't just conquer their land. You have to literally overwrite their understanding of the cosmos, their ethics, and their very soul. To properly cover this massive historical arc, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. We'll start with the paradox of the pews. Then we'll look at the weapon of conquest, followed by suppressed cosmologies, the psychology of colonization, and finally wrap up with the modern spiritual awakening. Let's jump in. Okay, part 1, the paradox of the pews. The researchers at Alvarez Consulting start everything off by pointing out this staggering, staring us right in the face irony. They ask us to consider the reality that the descendants of colonized peoples are currently the most devoted keepers of the colonizers' religion. When you break down the demographics, it's pretty profound. We're talking about approximately 79% of African Americans, 77% of U.S. Latinos, 80% of Black Caribbeans, and over 90% of Indigenous Mexicans identifying heavily with the exact religion brought over by European colonizers. Meanwhile, the actual ancestral traditions of these exact groups, systems like Ifa, Curanderismo, or Mayan cosmovision, exist mostly in fragmented, highly syncretic, or completely hidden forms today. So the report asks a really critical question here. Did this happen by spontaneous spiritual revelation, or was it by force? Which brings us to Section 2, the weapon of conquest. And the report is explicitly clear here. This demographic shift was absolutely not a matter of free spiritual choice. It was a brutal mechanism of conquest where the cross and the sword were wielded as a single instrument. When you map it out, you see this centuries-long legal theater of domination. Back in 1493, the Papal Bull Inter Caetera essentially gave Spain the green light to conquer any lands not ruled by a Christian. Picture this. Conquistadors would read a document out loud in Spanish to indigenous people who obviously didn't speak a word of Spanish, demanding total submission to the Pope. If they said no, they were enslaved or killed. And get this, the Vatican didn't formally repudiate this specific doctrine of discovery until 2023. That is wild. This was never a gentle offering of faith. It was a highly organized system of erasure. To really put the sheer scale of this destruction into perspective, the researchers point to conservative demographic estimates showing that 90%, let that sink in, 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within just 1 century of European contact. That is roughly 15 million people wiped out through a devastating combination of warfare, enslavement, disease, and cultural destruction happening all at once. So it is absolutely crucial to catalog exactly what was targeted to make sure this new religion took root. They didn't just knock down temples, they went after the data. The Mayan codices, which held centuries of invaluable astronomy and medicine, were dragged out and burned. The Inca Kupu, this brilliantly complex knot-based data encoding system, confiscated. The Yoruba Ifa system was systematically labeled as satanic by missionaries. The colonial strategy recognized something very dark. To erase a people, you must erase their archives, their sciences, and their elders. Moving to Section 3, suppressed cosmologies. The report makes a massive historical correction here, stressing that the things that were destroyed were not primitive superstitions. Not even close. They were highly evolved, structurally coherent sciences of consciousness. Take the Yoruba concept of Ori, for example. This represents an incredibly sophisticated understanding of personal divine destiny and ethics. It literally teaches that the divine consciousness is seated right within the individual. It's so profound that today, UNESCO recognizes it as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Yet for centuries, colonial missionaries entirely contradicted this reality, aggressively labeling these exact practices as demonic witchcraft. It's the exact same story with the Mayan long count and Tzolk'in calendars. We aren't just talking about basic computational math used for farming. These systems formed a vast initiatory map of reality that rivaled and in many ways exceeded Western astronomy of the time. The Maya understood time not as a flat, boring line, but as a living, cyclical force that required specific human engagement and deep spiritual alignment. I really appreciate how the report strongly pushes back against historical reductionism here. Whenever people think of Aztec, or more accurately Mexica religion, popular history immediately jumps to human sacrifice. But as the researchers brilliantly point out, doing that is the exact equivalent of reducing all of Christianity solely to the violence of the Inquisition. Mexico cosmology actually included vast, elegant concepts like Teotl, an impersonal, all-pervasive, self-renewing divine energy that mirrors the profound ideas you'd find in Taoism or Stoic philosophy. And that brings us to one of the most consequential revelations in the whole analysis. These suppressed African and indigenous systems, they actually share massive underlying parallels with esoteric Christian and perennial traditions. For instance, the Yoruba focus on the divine within is basically a direct mirror of the Gnostic teaching that the kingdom is within you. The Kemetic focus on cosmic order, Ma'at, aligns perfectly with the Hermetic principle of as above, so below. The report heavily suggests these suppressed traditions were actually expressing universal human truths about consciousness. All right, Section 4, the psychology of colonization. So the big question is, how on earth did this massive paradigm shift stick around and sustain itself long after formal legal colonialism ended? Well, that comes down to psychological operations. The researchers outline a devastating four-step chronological mechanism. First, missionaries entirely redefined indigenous deities as literal demons. Step 2 was violent language destruction, literally beating indigenous languages out of children in boarding schools to sever the oral transmission of complex ideas. Third, they built a system of social reward and punishment where your physical safety and economic survival were exclusively tied to converting to Christianity. And finally, step 4, intergenerational embedding. By the third or fourth generation, children were simply born with absolutely no alternative frame of reference. This total psychological embedding created something truly tragic. Drawing on Dr. Joy DeGruy's concept of post-traumatic slave syndrome, the report applies this framework to the spiritual domain. Communities were eventually conditioned to violently police each other's beliefs. Practicing your ancestral ways meant your own neighbors would label you a heathen. As the report so powerfully states, the colonizer had outsourced the enforcement. The masterpiece of colonial religion is that, eventually, it just runs itself. Which brings us to our final section, the modern spiritual awakening. Because here's the incredible truth. Despite that deep psychological embedding, and despite the immense wealth and cultural authority institutional Christianity holds globally today, the suppressed traditions never fully died. They just went underground. What is truly staggering to see is that we are right in the middle of a massive, practitioner-led awakening. Global reclamation movements are actively pulling these sophisticated systems out from syncretic hiding and back into the light. From the massive global Ifa and Orisha revival, to the rapid growth of the Mexica Danza Conchera movement across the US and Mexico, to a true renaissance in understanding Haitian Vodou as a complete, beautiful theology. People are waking up to the fact that you can bury the soul of a culture, but you absolutely cannot erase it. So Alvarez Consulting concludes by advocating a really constructive path forward for all of us. And importantly, they are not arguing for spiritual homelessness or forced division within communities. Instead, they are advocating for historical literacy. They want to encourage individuals to do the ancestral research, engage in comparative theology, and reclaim their culture without just reproducing the trauma. It's all about having open, honest community dialogue and actually knowing the full history of the faith you practice. I want to leave you with this final, incredibly provocative thought drawn directly from the report's conclusion. I'd love for you to honestly reflect for a moment on the origins of the spiritual framework you navigate today. Is it truly chosen, or was it assigned to your ancestors by a system explicitly designed to erase their profound cosmological wisdom? Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer. Keep asking those hard questions and keep exploring the history that's hiding just beneath the surface.